G'day everyone, welcome to the third of my legal explainers. Today I want to look at the question of what is a refugee? Refugees and concerns about refugees have been part of the Australian landscape for many years. If you can believe this, the alleged children overboard incident was 15 years ago already, and the issue doesn't look like going away anytime soon. People seek Australia's protection every day. Most of them arrive by plane and a small proportion arrive by boat. I've found that many people really only have a very basic understanding of what a refugee actually is. By talking about this issue, however, I'm potentially delving into great controversy. This is an issue that good, sincere people on both sides of the argument have very strong feelings about. I'm not going to try and suggest whether individual people or groups should be treated as refugees. I'm not going to try to say what Australia's policy should be in relation to refugees. I'm just going to try to explain the law in a way that I hope will be helpful, no matter what your perspective. There have been refugees throughout history, but the story we are telling really starts with the end of the Second World War. Millions of people had been displaced from their homes. Many had fled to other countries. Entire governments had been established in exile. Some people couldn't return home because their cities had been devastated, and others were really not required to return home because the end of the Second World War saw the start of the Cold War, and anyone who could escape from, say, East Germany was welcomed with open arms. The nations of the world realised as a result of the Second World War that there needed to be rules to help make some sort of order from the chaos of large-scale refugee movements. And so, very soon after the establishment of the United Nations, the nations of the world agreed to the 1951 United Nations Convention relating to the status of refugees. At this time, in 2016, 144 nations have signed up to that treaty, and 146 have signed up to a later related agreement called a protocol. Now, there are roughly 190 countries in the world, so that's pretty good coverage. Australia has signed up to both the convention and the protocol. The very first article of the convention tells us what a refugee is. It says the term applies to a person who, owing to a well-founded fear of being persecuted for reasons of race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group or political opinion, is outside the country of his nationality and is unable, or owing to such fear is unwilling, to avail himself of the protection of the country. Now, because it's an international agreement, that doesn't automatically apply in Australia, not until it's written into Australian law. But it has been. Section 5, capital H of our Australian Migration Act defines a refugee as a person who is outside the country of his or her nationality and owing to a well-founded fear of persecution is unable or unwilling to avail himself of the protection of that country. Now that's a bit of a mouthful, let's break it down. The first thing is that the refugee has to be outside the country of their nationality. So a person who's still in their own country, even if that country is a war zone, is not a refugee as far as the law is concerned. That doesn't mean we won't help them. Australia has a proud record of humanitarian assistance to all sorts of countries in all sorts of circumstances. But it does mean that those people are not, legally speaking, refugees. So let's assume a person has made it outside their country. The next thing is they must have fear. The Refugee Convention protects people who are fearful. What this means in a practical sense is that people who say they're trying to reach Australia to have a better life or to provide opportunities for their children, or people who are trying to escape poverty or environmental disaster, these people are not refugees. They might still be fantastic people who we would be proud to accept as Australians, but they are not refugees in the legal sense. So back to our definition, it has to be fear of persecution. What does that mean? Well, persecution involves serious harm and systematic and discriminatory conduct. So some loss of rights or some poor treatment which sets the person below other people in their country. Now, under our law, Australian law, that persecution has to be for reasons of the person's race, their religion, their nationality, their membership of a particular social group, or their political opinions. When we talk about a social group, that might include a family, but it might include any other social group. So, for instance, a person who was persecuted for being gay would be protected as being part of that social group, the social group of people who are or who are perceived to be gay. You can see this is pretty broad. Most people who are being persecuted wouldn't have too much trouble fitting into one of these categories. Next, the fear of persecution has to be well-founded. This is often the sticking point for refugee applications. After all, people can be fearful of all sorts of things. Fear is terribly idiosyncratic. I might fear persecution because I know lots of people hate lawyers, but that really wouldn't make me a refugee if I sought asylum in another country. Australian law says that a fear of persecution is well-founded if there is a real chance of persecution of that person. Finally, the person has to be unable or unwilling to seek protection in their own country. This makes sense. If a person was being persecuted by, say, their neighbours, then they could go to the police. They wouldn't be a refugee. Often, though, refugees are in fact being persecuted by the government or police. Or alternatively, there's been such a breakdown of law and order in their country that there's no real protection available. So, if a person is outside their country, they fear persecution. They fear persecution because of their race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group or political opinions, and they can't obtain protection at home, then they're a refugee. Almost. You see, now that we know the basic rule, there are a number of exceptions we need to understand. First and foremost, a person is not a refugee if they've committed war crimes, crimes against humanity, or acts contrary to the principles of the United Nations. Similarly, if a person's committed what's called a serious non-political crime outside Australia, so something like a rape or a murder, but not a so-called crime such as criticising the government in a one-party state. Second, under Australian law, a person cannot claim a well-founded fear of persecution if they have not taken all possible steps to obtain protection in their own country and in any other country that they might have passed through on the way to Australia. This is a very controversial aspect of the Australian law because many refugees who arrive in Australia by boat from the Middle East are likely to come here by way of Pakistan, India, Malaysia or Indonesia, none of whom are signatories to the United Nations Convention relating to the status of refugees. So it may not be possible for people to seek protection in any of those intervening countries at all. In fact, in a straight line between Afghanistan and Australia, Cambodia is the only country which is a signatory to the convention. So where does that leave us? If a person is outside their country, they have a fear of persecution. The fear is well founded because there's a real chance of persecution actually happening. They've not committed major non-political crimes and they've taken all possible steps to obtain protection in their own country. Well, then they are a refugee and Australia owes them the obligations of protection. Now, those obligations are worth an explainer in themselves, and I won't be going into them today, or this will become a very long presentation. Before we wrap up, though, two more things. First, you need to understand that this is a legal definition of a refugee, and it's a definition that I've tried to dramatically simplify in order to make it understandable. Many people believe Australia's definition of refugees is far too tight, and that it should include all people from countries in conflict. And perhaps it should also include those fleeing poverty or environmental disaster. Those are perfectly reasonable points for political discussion, but I'm trying to reflect the law as it stands today. Second, on a topic like this, I think it's important that I disclose a couple of things about myself. First, in 2009, during my military service, I was deployed on Operation Resolute, so I was part of the process of patrolling for and intercepting boat arrivals. Second, with a name like Marinac, you might guess that my family didn't arrive with the first fleet. In fact, my grandparents arrived in Australia in 1950, and their coming to Australia was facilitated by the International Refugee Organisation. So if you think either of those aspects of my personal background have affected the description I've given in this explainer, you might want to take that into account. I hope this has been a helpful guide to the legal meaning of a refugee. As ever, if you have any thoughts about topics that you'd like presented in future explainers, I'd love to hear from you at anthony.marinac@gmail.com.